want them to help you out, but you can't just give over your power like that. You have to be understanding that the choices that I make have to be mine. They can't be yours.
Alicia Keys built one of the most perfect images in music history. But behind every perfect image is a secret somebody is desperate to protect. At 45, that secret finally has a name. What did she spend decades hiding, and who was she protecting all along? The silence that changed everything. Alicia Keys has always known how to hold a note, and she has always known how to hold a secret. For more than 2 decades, she stood on some of the biggest stages in the world, won Grammy after Grammy, and smiled for every camera pointed at her face. She looked like a woman in complete control of her life, her music, and her story. But behind all of that success, behind the sold-out arenas and the magazine covers, there were names that rarely got mentioned, names that carried enormous power, or names that shaped her career in ways the public never fully understood. Clive Davis was one of those names, the man behind some of the biggest careers in music history, a record executive with a reputation for spotting talent and then molding it into exactly what he wanted it to be. Jay-Z was another, one of the most powerful figures in hip-hop, a businessman as much as an artist, with connections that stretched far beyond any recording studio. Both men played a role in building the Alicia Keys the world came to know and love. But the question that has quietly followed her career for years is a simple one. Was the woman the public saw the real Alicia Keys, or was she a carefully designed version of herself, shaped by powerful hands working just out of sight? At 44, Alicia has begun opening up in ways she never did before. Like small moments, careful words, hints at a story that is much bigger than the highlights reel. For years, she said nothing, and that silence protected someone. The question is who? But before we look at the powerful men who shaped her future, we need to go back to where it all began, to a little girl in Hell's Kitchen who had nothing but a piano and a dream. The born are in struggle. Hell's Kitchen in the 1980s was not an easy place to grow up. It was a neighborhood in New York City that carried its name for a reason. Rough streets, tough people, and very little room for dreaming. But it was here, in the middle of all that hardship, that Alicia Augello Cook was born on January 25th, 1981, the daughter of a single mother named Teria Joseph, a woman who worked incredibly hard just to keep a roof over their heads.
You know, my mother left Toledo, Ohio, to come to study at NYU, and she is that New York story. You know,
Teria was a paralegal and a part-time actress, juggling everything on her own after Alicia's father walked out of their lives when Alicia was just 2 years old. That absence left a mark, not just on the family's finances, but on Alicia's emotional world, and it was a wound she would carry quietly for many years. Growing up without her father meant growing up fast, learning early that life did not hand you anything, that you had to reach for it yourself. The piano came into her life when she was 7 years old.
I always wanted to play piano, and I don't know why I always wanted to play piano. There's no reason. There's no even story of like a family member that did or whatever. I just wanted to play.
And from the very first moment her fingers touched the keys, something shifted. Music was not just something she enjoyed, it was something she needed. A language that made sense when everything else around her felt uncertain. She studied classical piano with a discipline that was rare for a child her age, working through compositions by Mozart and Chopin while other kids were outside playing. And her teachers noticed almost immediately that they were dealing with someone extraordinary. She was not just talented, she was focused in a way that felt almost unnatural for someone so young. Practicing for hours without being asked, absorbing everything her teachers gave her, and then pushing further on her own. By the time she was a teenager, she was writing her own songs, blending the classical training she had worked so hard to master with the rhythm and soul of the music she heard growing up in New York, creating something that was entirely and completely her own. Her mother saw what was happening and made sacrifices to keep it going, paying for lessons, supporting her daughter's obsession, believing in something she could not yet fully see but somehow knew was real. Alicia Keys was not born into privilege or connections. She was born into struggle, and she turned that struggle into something the world had never quite heard before. But talent alone was never going to be enough, because the music industry does not reward gifts. It rewards the people who can be shaped, and someone was already watching. Sfand, too young. By the time most teenagers were worrying about homework and weekend plans, Alicia Keys was already operating in a world that most adults would find overwhelming. She had been accepted into the prestigious Professional Performing Arts School in Manhattan, a school designed for young people whose talents placed them in a completely different category, and she thrived there, excelling academically while continuing to develop her music with a seriousness that set her apart from nearly everyone around her. She graduated at just 16 years old, finishing at the top of her class with a grade point average that earned her a place at Columbia University, one of the most respected universities in the entire country. It was an achievement that would have made any parent proud, and for Teria, who had sacrificed so much to give her daughter every possible opportunity, it meant everything. But Alicia had already made up her mind, and no university acceptance letter was going to change it, because by the time that letter arrived, she had already signed a record deal. Columbia Records had come into the picture when Alicia was just 15 years old, drawn in by a girl whose talent was impossible to ignore. The deal felt like a dream, a major label, real resources, real infrastructure, and the kind of platform that most young artists spend their entire careers trying to reach. For a teenager from Hell's Kitchen, with no industry connections and no safety net, it felt like the door to everything she had ever wanted had swung open. She chose music over Columbia University without hesitation, walking away from an academic future that most people would have clung to with both hands, because she believed in what she was building, believed in her songs, her sound, and her ability to connect with people through music in a way that no classroom could teach her. It was a bold decision, the kind that takes a rare combination of confidence and courage, and at 15, most people do not have either in the quantity she did. Her mother supported the choice, trusting her daughter's instincts even when the path ahead was far from certain. But what looked like the beginning of something extraordinary was already more complicated than it appeared, because Columbia Records had not signed Alicia Keys to let her be herself. They had signed her because they believed they could turn her into something far more commercially convenient. What looked like a dream deal was already falling apart behind the scenes, and the girl who had fought so hard to find her voice was about to discover just how hard the industry would fight to silence it. The label that tried to break her, Alicia Keys, walked into Columbia Records as a teenager with a vision, a sound, and a level of creative certainty that most artists twice her age never develop. She knew what she wanted to make a music that was honest, rooted in soul and rhythm and blues, layered with the classical training she had spent years building, music that sounded like her, only her, nothing else. The problem was that Columbia Records had a very different idea about what Alicia Keys should sound like. Almost immediately, the tension began. The label pushed her toward a more commercial direction, something safer, more polished, easier to package and sell to a mainstream audience that they felt they understood better than she did. They brought in outside songwriters, people she had never met, to craft material they believed would suit her better than anything she could write herself. They had opinions about her image, her presentation, the way she should look and move and speak in public. And very few of those opinions had anything to do with the girl, who had spent years developing her craft in Hell's Kitchen. Alicia pushed back, not quietly, and not without cost. She refused to simply become what they wanted her to be, holding on to her own songs and her own creative instincts with a grip that frustrated the executives around her. For a teenager with no real industry leverage, no famous connections, and no proven commercial track record, this was an enormous risk. Labels had ended careers for far less, and everyone around her knew it. The years she spent at Columbia were years of constant friction, of meetings where her ideas were dismissed, of sessions where she was handed material she did not believe in and expected to perform it with conviction. And she recorded music during this period that she was never fully comfortable with, work that sat in a drawer somewhere because the two sides could never agree on what Alicia Keys was supposed to be. It wore on her, but it did not break her, because the same discipline that had carried her through years of piano practice and academic achievement kept her standing when the pressure mounted. She was not the kind of person who folded, and the label was beginning to realize that the girl they had signed was not going to become the product they had imagined. Then the label made a move that could have ended her career before it ever truly began. They let her go. It's dropping her at 19 and closing the door on everything she had worked toward. But sometimes a closed door is the only thing standing between where you are and where you were always meant to be. Losing, everything or winning, freedom. Being dropped by a major record label at 19 years old is the kind of thing that breaks most people, the kind of moment that sends young artists back home, back to ordinary lives, carrying the quiet weight of a dream that almost happened. For Alicia Keys, it was something else entirely. It was the moment the story actually began. Columbia Records had let her go, and on paper, it looked like failure. But the reality was far more complicated than that, because Alicia had not failed to deliver. She had simply refused to deliver something that was not hers. And there is an enormous difference between those two things. With the label gone, she suddenly had something she had not truly had since the day she signed at 15. Freedom. There were no more meetings where her ideas were dismissed. No more outside writers being handed her sessions. No more executives telling her what Alicia Keys was supposed to sound like. For the first time in years, the music she was making belonged entirely to her. And she worked with an intensity that reflected exactly how much that mattered. She spent this period writing and recording, with a focus that those around her described as almost relentless, pouring everything she had been holding back during her Columbia years into songs that were deeply personal, emotionally honest, and musically ambitious in ways the label had never allowed her to explore. The classical influences were there, the soul and rhythm and blues were there, and layered underneath all of it was something rarer. A genuine point of view, a perspective shaped by real experience and real pain. She was also building something else during this time. Connections, quiet but important relationships with people inside the industry who recognized what she was doing and understood its value. She was not loud about it. She was never the kind of person who moved through rooms making noise. But she was paying attention, learning how the business worked, understanding who the real decision makers were and what they actually responded to. She was 19 years old, without a label, without a guaranteed future. But she was more herself than she had ever been allowed to be inside a major recording contract. And that authenticity was about to attract exactly the right kind of attention. Because one man had been watching from a distance, a man who had built more careers than almost anyone else in the history of the music business, and he had seen enough to know that what Alicia Keys had was something rare. Clive Davis takes control. Clive Davis was not a man who needed much convincing when he believed in something, and from the moment he encountered Alicia Keys and the music she had been quietly building on her own, he believed completely. Davis was a legend in the truest sense of the word, the executive responsible for launching and shaping the careers of artists like Whitney Houston, Bruce Springsteen, and Aretha Franklin. A man whose instincts about talent had proven correct so many times that the industry had long since stopped questioning them. He signed Alicia to J Records, the label he had founded after leaving Arista. And from the outside, it looked like exactly the rescue her career needed. A powerful man stepping in at the perfect moment to give a gifted young woman the platform she deserved. In many ways, that was precisely what it was. Davis gave her resources, access, and the kind of industry infrastructure that independent artists could only dream about. And crucially, he gave her something Columbia had never offered, a genuine willingness to listen to what she wanted to make. But Clive Davis did not build a career as long and as successful as his by simply handing artists the keys and stepping back. He was a collaborator in the deepest sense of the word, deeply involved in the creative process, with strong opinions about what worked and what did not, and an ability to shape an artist's output in ways that were subtle enough to feel like support, but firm enough to be something more. He helped reposition her debut album, working with her to refine and strategically place the music she had developed, making decisions about sequencing, singles, and presentation that reflected decades of experience in understanding what the public responded to. The album that eventually emerged, Songs in a Minor, was still unmistakably Alicia, her voice, her piano, her emotional honesty. But it had also been carefully shaped for maximum impact by one of the sharpest minds the industry had ever produced. The result was historic. Songs in a Minor sold more than 200,000 copies in its first week alone, making it one of the fastest-selling debut albums ever recorded by a female artist. And the world suddenly knew exactly who Alicia Keys was. She had creative freedom, genuine artistic expression, and a platform that matched her talent. But it had all come through the careful guidance of a man with his own very clear vision of what success should look like. The question that lingered quietly beneath all of that achievement was a simple but important one. Was this the freedom she had always fought for, or just a more polished and sophisticated kind of control? The perfect star is built after songs. In a Minor announced her to the world, Alicia Keys did not slow down. She accelerated. is building on her debut with a consistency and professionalism that the industry rarely sees from artists so early in their careers. Album after album arrived with the same qualities that had made the first one such a phenomenon: emotional depth, musical intelligence, and a vocal ability that placed her in a category occupied by very few of her contemporaries. She won Grammy Awards in numbers that most artists never reach across an entire lifetime, becoming one of the most decorated musicians of her generation. And with each award, each sold-out tour, each acclaimed record, the image of Alicia Keys grew more defined and more carefully maintained. She was the gifted one, the serious one, the artist who wore her natural hair and spoke about empowerment and stayed above the noise that swallowed so many of her peers. It was a powerful image. And it was not entirely manufactured, because the talent was absolutely real. The discipline was real. The emotional intelligence she brought to her music was genuinely hers. But an image, even once built on real foundations, still requires maintenance, still requires decisions about what to show and what to keep hidden, what stories to tell, and which ones to let quietly disappear. Alicia moved through the height of her fame with a remarkable ability to stay out of the kind of controversy that derailed other artists. She gave interviews that were thoughtful and carefully worded. She stayed away from feuds, avoided the tabloid stories that followed so many of her peers, and presented a version of herself to the public that felt both authentic and completely untouchable. The people around her, her management, her label, her inner circle, they all played a role in maintaining that image. Because a career built on the idea of authenticity is one that requires enormous care to protect. One wrong move, one unguarded moment, one story that did not fit the narrative, and the whole carefully constructed picture could shift in ways that were very difficult to recover from. She was a global star by every measurable standard, with an influence that extended far beyond music into fashion, culture, and conversations about what it meant for a Black woman to hold real power in a predominantly white industry. And she wore all of it with a grace that made it look effortless. But the more perfect her image became, the more certain people began to look a little closer, asking questions about the woman behind the carefully curated surface. First, and some of those questions were about to get very uncomfortable. The song that changed everything. In 2009, Jay-Z was putting together what would become one of the most celebrated albums of his career, The Blueprint 3, a record that was ambitious in scope and deeply personal in its vision of New York City as a cultural force that the rest of the world could not ignore. At the center of that vision was a song, an anthem really, that would go on to become one of the most recognizable pieces of popular music of the entire decade. Empire's State of Mind almost did not happen the way it did. The hook, that soaring, emotionally charged chorus that would make the song impossible to forget, was not originally written with Alicia Keys in mind. There were other names considered, other voices that could have filled that space. And the history of the song could have looked very different if different decisions had been made at different moments. But Jay-Z and his team brought Alicia in, and what she delivered transformed the record entirely. Her voice carrying the chorus with a weight and a warmth that turned a great hip-hop track into something that felt stayed there, and became the kind of cultural moment that people remember exactly where they were when they first heard it. A love letter to New York that resonated far beyond the city itself. For Alicia, it was another peak in a career already full of them. Confirmation that her voice and her presence could elevate any project she touched, and it cemented a professional relationship with Jay-Z that had now produced something undeniable and permanent. The collaboration made sense on every level. Two of the most successful artists of their generation, both deeply connected to New York, both operating at the very top of their respective spaces in the industry. It felt natural, organic, the kind of creative partnership that the music world celebrated without hesitation. But not everyone saw it that simply, because Jay-Z was not just a recording artist. He was one of the most powerful business figures in the entire entertainment industry, with influence that extended into every corner of the music world. And some people believe that his connection to Alicia Keys went far deeper than one unforgettable chorus. Those voices were about to get much louder. Rumors, power, and silence. There are people in the music industry who speak carefully, who weigh every word before it leaves their mouth, who understand that in a business built on image and perception, what you say can matter just as much as what you do. Jaguar Wright was never one of those people. And in the years following her own experiences inside the industry, She became one of its most vocal and controversial critics. Wright had been connected to the Rockefeller Records world in the early 2000s, and her allegations, delivered across social media with a bluntness that left very little room for interpretation, targeted some of the most powerful names in music, Jay-Z among them. But it was what she said about Alicia Keys that cut through the noise in a particular way. Claims about manipulation, about the use of personal relationships to secure professional advantages. Boas about a carefully maintained public image that she alleged did not reflect what was actually happening behind closed doors. The accusations were explosive, and they spread quickly, carried by the kind of social media momentum that does not wait for facts to be verified before it reaches millions of people. Supporters of Wright pointed to her insider knowledge as evidence that she was telling the truth, while others questioned her motivations and the lack of concrete evidence behind some of her most serious claims. What made the situation more complicated was the response from Alicia herself, which was no response at all. She simply continued moving forward, releasing music, showing up for her commitments, and maintaining the same composed and carefully controlled public presence she had always projected. In most situations, silence can be read as guilt, as an admission that there is something worth hiding. But in Alicia's case, her silence had a different quality to it. It felt deliberate, considered. The choice of someone who had learned long ago that engaging with certain conversations only gave them more oxygen than they deserved. The industry watched, the public speculated, and the questions multiplied without any answers arriving to settle them. In a world built on noise, her silence had become the loudest statement she could possibly make. But even that silence could not protect her from what was coming next. Love, scandal, and public judgment. There are moments in a public figure's life that no amount of careful image management can fully prepare them for. Moments when the personal becomes so visible and so raw that the carefully maintained distance between the star and the story simply collapses. For Alicia Keys, that moment arrived not through her music or her industry relationships, but through love. Her relationship with Kasim Dean, known professionally as Swizz Beatz, began while he was still legally married to singer and songwriter Mashonda Tifrere. And when the details became public, the reaction was immediate and fierce. Mashonda spoke openly about her pain, about the breakdown of her marriage, about what she believed had happened between her husband and Alicia, and her words resonated with a public that had always seen Alicia as the embodiment of integrity and moral seriousness. The woman who had built a career on authenticity and emotional honesty was suddenly at the center of a story that felt like a direct contradiction of everything her image represented, and the backlash was significant. Social media amplified every opinion, every judgment, every piece of commentary from people who felt genuinely betrayed by someone they had admired and trusted. Alicia said very little, staying true to the pattern of silence that had defined her response to controversy throughout her career, continuing to work, continuing to perform, allowing time to do what public statements rarely can, which is shift the conversation without forcing it. She married Swizz Beatz in 2010, and together they built a blended family that eventually included children from both of their previous relationships. A life that from the outside looked settled and genuinely happy. In a remarkable turn, Mashonda and Alicia eventually reached a place of reconciliation, even co-writing a book together about co-parenting with grace and intention, a resolution that surprised many people who had followed the original story. It was a redemption arc that felt real rather than manufactured, evidence that the situation had been more complicated than the initial headlines suggested, and that the people involved had found a way through it that served their children and their own well-being. But reconciliation does not erase history, and the questions that had been raised about who Alicia Keys really was beneath the polished surface had never fully gone away, because new rumors were already beginning to surface, and this time they reached further back than anyone expected. Legacy, power, and the final question. By any measure that the music industry uses to define greatness, Alicia Keys has earned her place among the finest artists of her generation. 15 Grammy Awards, over 85 million records sold worldwide, a career spanning more than 2 decades without a single moment of creative surrender. The numbers alone tell a story of extraordinary achievement, but numbers have never been the most interesting thing about her. What makes her story compelling is not the awards or the sales figures, it is the tension that has run quietly beneath all of it. The question of how much of what the world saw was truly her, and how much was carefully constructed by the powerful men who stood behind her at every major turning point. Forward Clive Davis shaped her debut and guided her early years with a precision that produced historic results. Jay-Z pulled her into one of the biggest songs of the decade, and both relationships raised questions that never received clean answers. In recent years, old rumors have resurfaced with new energy, carried by social media conversations that move faster and reach further than anything the industry could have anticipated when Alicia first stepped into a recording studio as a teenager. Questions about her personal life, her industry relationships, and the true nature of the alliances that built her career have found new audiences who are asking them with fresh urgency. Alicia Keys has responded to all of it the way she has always responded, with composure, with silence, where silence serves her, and with music that continues to speak in ways that interviews never could.
Accepted, you know, people had to agree with me, or people had to accept what I thought for it to be good, and now I don't.
But the final question remains, one that her entire career seems to circle without ever fully answering. Was Alicia Keys always in control of her own story? Or did she simply become brilliant at surviving a system that was never truly built for her?